Donald Trump just issued the most aggressive trade ultimatum in the history of the United States-Canada relationship. Not a warning, not a negotiation signal, an ultimatum. A sitting American president looked north and told one of the country's oldest allies, the nation that shares the longest peaceful border in the world, comply or face economic annihilation. And Mark Carney, Canada's newly minted prime minister, a man who has guided central banks through two of the worst financial crises of the modern era, didn't flinch, not for a single second. What happened in the 72 hours that followed that ultimatum should alarm every American who believes in constitutional governance, economic stability, and the rule of treaty law. This isn't just about tariffs. This is about whether the United States of America still means what it signs. This is about whether a sitting president can tear up a trade agreement he personally negotiated and bragged about without any consequence. When the leader of a G7 nation publicly declares that the old relationship is over, you know something tectonic has shifted. Hit that subscribe button right now because you will not want to miss any of the coverage I release on this story. This is just the beginning. So what set off this extraordinary confrontation? On February 24, 2026, Donald Trump posted a message to Truth Social at approximately 6:15 in the morning. No press briefing scheduled, no advance notice to Congress, no consultation with the United States Trade Representative, just a social media post sent before most of official Washington had even poured their first cup of coffee, declaring that Canada would face a 35% tariff on all goods, not the 25% that had been floated in prior weeks, but 35% effective in 14 days, unless Ottawa agreed to a list of conditions that sources close to the negotiations described as deliberately maximalist and designed to humiliate. This isn't just another political controversy. This is a constitutional and economic crisis unfolding in real time. And believe me, when a Prime Minister of Canada responds the way Mark Carney responded, you know something enormous has just detonated in the North American economic order. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions between Washington and Ottawa had been building since December of 2025, fueled by Trump's repeated suggestions that Canada should consider becoming the 51st state of the United States, statements that Canadian officials initially treated as hyperbole, but which grew increasingly alarming as Trump's team began privately pressuring Canadian diplomats to stop publicly rebuking the idea. Multiple sources familiar with those conversations described the atmosphere in the diplomatic backchannel as deteriorating rapidly by mid-January. But everything escalated on February 17, 2026, when a senior White House economic advisor gave an off-the-record briefing to a group of Washington journalists, in which the outline of the new tariff strategy was described in blunt terms. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail and the Washington Post, that briefing made clear that the Trump administration viewed Canada's resistance to sovereignty messaging as a political provocation requiring economic punishment. The leaked summary of that briefing, circulated among parliamentary staff in Ottawa within 48 hours, contained language that sources described as incendiary. This wasn't about trade deficits. It was about submission. Carney's government recognized it immediately. And here's where it really gets serious. When Carney's economic team reviewed the leaked briefing summary on February 19th, they convened what multiple sources described as a war game session lasting nearly 6 hours in the basement of the Langevin block, the building adjacent to the House of Commons where the Prime Minister's office operates. The participants included Canada's finance minister, the governor of the Bank of Canada, senior trade counsel from Global Affairs Canada, and, in a development that has drawn significant attention in Ottawa, two former senior officials from the International Monetary Fund, who had worked alongside Carney during his tenure at the Bank of England. This was not a reactive scramble. This was a prepared response apparatus activating a contingency plan that had apparently been in development for weeks. Here's what sources say happened next. On the morning of February 24th, minutes after Trump's Truth Social post landed, Carney's chief of staff placed a call to the Prime Minister, who was already awake, and, according to a government official who was present, described the post as consistent with what we anticipated. Carney convened a cabinet-level call within the hour. The group agreed that the response needed to meet 3 criteria. It had to be immediate, it had to be economically credible, and it had to signal to the world, not just to Washington, that Canada was not playing defense. Meanwhile, at 7:45 that same morning, Reuters reported that Canadian trade attorneys had already begun drafting formal complaints to the USMCA Dispute Resolution Panel. By 9 a.m., the Canadian Embassy in Washington had contacted the offices of 22 U.S. senators representing states with significant trade exposure to Canada, including Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, and Ohio, to brief their staffs on the potential economic impact before Carney made his public statement. Sources on Capitol Hill confirmed those calls were received. Several described the briefings as extraordinarily detailed and professionally executed. Now here is where things get absolutely explosive. At 11 a.m. Eastern on February 24th, Mark Carney appeared before cameras at Rideau Cottage in Ottawa. No teleprompter, no prepared remarks visible. A man standing at a podium with the composure, as one observer put it, of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Carney began his statement without preamble. His voice was level. His cadence was deliberate. "The United States has issued an ultimatum," Carney said. "We do not accept ultimatums. Canada is not a client state. We are a sovereign nation, a founding member of NATO, a treaty partner, and the largest trading relationship this country has ever had." The press gallery in Ottawa fell silent. "As of today," Carney continued, "Canada is initiating a full review of all export permits for critical minerals destined for the United States, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements essential to American defense manufacturing. We are also announcing immediate reciprocal tariffs of 35% on all American consumer goods. And we are formally invoking Chapter 31 of the USMCA agreement to challenge the legal basis of these tariffs before an international dispute panel." Reporters leaned forward. Several Canadian officials standing behind Carney exchanged glances. "The United States will find," Carney added, pausing for precisely 3 seconds, "that threatening Canada has consequences." That phrase, "that Canada has consequences," sent shockwaves through Washington within minutes. The word went out immediately on financial terminals. U.S. automakers, whose supply chains require Canadian-made components, saw their share prices drop 3.7% in the first hour of trading after the statement. Energy stocks in the Midwest began sliding. The S&P 500 fell 94 points by noon. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. This isn't the first time a U.S. president has overplayed an economic hand with a major ally and suffered the consequences. Think back to Ronald Reagan's trade disputes with Japan in the 1980s. The imposition of semiconductor tariffs drew coordinated retaliation and ultimately forced a negotiated agreement on American terms only after serious damage to the relationship. Reagan understood eventually that economic allies are not vassals. The dispute ended with diplomacy, not domination. Then there was George W. Bush's steel tariffs in 2002. Bush imposed broad tariffs on imported steel, believing it would protect American manufacturing jobs in swing states ahead of midterm elections. The European Union, Canada, and Japan immediately threatened retaliatory tariffs on politically targeted American exports: Florida orange juice, Michigan steel, California wine. Within 19 months, Bush rescinded the tariffs entirely. The World Trade Organization ruled against the United States. The lesson was unambiguous. The key difference here, Trump has now imposed these measures not as a trade policy instrument, but as a political coercion tool in a relationship governed by a treaty he personally negotiated. The USMCA, which Trump signed with enormous fanfare in January 2020 and repeatedly cited as the greatest trade deal in history, contains specific procedural requirements for tariff adjustments. Multiple legal experts have said Trump's February 24th action appears to violate those requirements directly. Jonathan Freed, former Canadian ambassador to the World Trade Organization and the OECD, told Global News that this is an extraordinary situation because you have a signatory to a treaty invoking emergency tariff powers that the treaty explicitly constrains. He noted that Canada's decision to invoke Chapter 31 was calibrated precisely to put that legal question before an international body where American domestic politics carry no weight. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm every American watching this situation. Trump's ultimatum didn't just damage a trade relationship. It may have triggered a legal mechanism that could bind future American administrations in ways that have not yet been fully calculated. International trade dispute panels, once invoked, operate on timelines and under rules that no president, Democratic or Republican, can simply override with a social media post. Canada knows this. Carney's team knows this. The question is whether anyone in the West Wing understood it before February 24th. This puts the Trump administration in a nearly impossible position. On one side, backing down now, rescinding the tariffs or agreeing to negotiate, means acknowledging publicly that the ultimatum failed. That undercuts the core messaging of economic strength that Trump's base has been sold. On the other side, proceeding with the 35% tariffs means triggering a chain of consequences that multiple analysts describe as potentially self-defeating. Retaliatory Canadian tariffs on American consumer goods, Canadian restrictions on critical mineral exports, essential to American defense and technology sectors, formal legal challenges before an international panel that could take 12 to 18 months to resolve, and a dramatic chilling effect on investment in American industries that depend on supply chain integration with Canada. There is no clean exit, and here's the tricky part. There's no credible defense. Either Trump's team failed to model Canada's response, which is a staggering failure of basic foreign policy analysis, or they modeled it, understood it, and went ahead anyway, which raises even more troubling questions about what they actually believe the end game looks like. Legal and political analysts are calling this a turning point in North American relations. Ian Lee, professor of business at Carleton University's Sprott School of Business, told CBC's Power and Politics that what's remarkable about Carney's response is that it operationalized economic retaliation at a speed and sophistication that Washington clearly did not anticipate. He explained that invoking the Critical Minerals Export Review was the move that changed the entire equation, because it put American defense contractors, not just auto manufacturers, in the position of having to call their congressional representatives. Even voices on the American political right have acknowledged the seriousness of the situation. The Wall Street Journal editorial board, which has historically been sympathetic to Trump's economic nationalism agenda, published a piece on the morning of February 25th describing the escalation as a self-inflicted wound and questioning whether the administration had a clear theory of how this ends. So let's break down what this could actually mean. First, the immediate economic impact. American consumers will begin to feel the effect of Canadian retaliatory tariffs within 30 to 60 days. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of consumer goods to the U.S. Midwest, including lumber, dairy, steel, and energy. Canadian officials have confirmed that the reciprocal tariff list was designed to target products manufactured and sold in states that supported Trump in 2024, including Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. This is economic retaliation with surgical political precision. Second, the defense and technology exposure. Canada is a principal supplier of cobalt and lithium, both critical to electric vehicle battery manufacturing and to components used in American military systems. A formal export review of those minerals, even before any permits are actually revoked, creates uncertainty that defense contractors cannot ignore. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon all have supply chain dependencies on Canadian-sourced minerals. Congressional staffers from both parties confirmed to Politico on February 25th that defense industry lobbying groups had already begun reaching out to the armed services committees. Third, the treaty precedent. If the USMCA dispute panel rules against the United States, and multiple trade law experts assess that outcome as the most likely result given the procedural requirements Trump bypassed, it creates a binding legal precedent that constrains American tariff authority under the existing agreement. That means a future administration trying to use the USMCA as a framework for stable trade policy will be operating in a legal environment damaged by this episode. This isn't just about Trump, it's about what comes after. But beyond the immediate economic and legal fallout, this is really about something more fundamental. It's about whether the United States government honors its treaty commitments. The USMCA was ratified by Congress, it was signed into law, it carries the full weight of American legal obligation. When a president acts in ways that legal experts say contradict that treaty's specific provisions, it does not just affect one trade relationship. It sends a signal to every nation that has ever signed an agreement with the United States about what those agreements are actually worth. This is causing genuine alarm within segments of the Republican foreign policy establishment. Reports from multiple Hill sources indicate that a closed-door session was held in the Senate Commerce Committee on February 25th, attended by both Republican and Democratic members, in which senior trade officials were asked pointed questions about the administration's legal rationale for the tariffs. Sources familiar with that session described the atmosphere as tense and the answers as unsatisfying. Meanwhile, American manufacturing and agriculture groups are deeply divided. Some have cautiously supported the tariff strategy. Others, including the American Farm Bureau, which represents the interests of farmers in states across the agricultural Midwest, released a statement on February 24th expressing serious concern about Canadian retaliatory measures that could affect American grain and livestock exports. Canada is the second largest market for American agricultural products. The Farm Bureau statement did not use the word disaster. It used the word alarming. In Washington, when the Farm Bureau says alarming, everyone in both parties listens. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view this situation. Here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Trump's response to Carney's statement came at 3:17 p.m. on February 24th. A Truth Social post that called Carney's response a weak and pathetic stunt by a man who was elected for 2 weeks and thinks he understands economics. Trump claimed Carney was bluffing. He insisted Canada would return to the table within 72 hours. He attacked the Canadian media for, in his words, celebrating the destruction of their own country. Carney's office issued no further public statement in response. They did not have to. The markets had already made the argument for them. Legal experts immediately flagged the problem with Trump's framing. When your public response to a credible economic and legal countermove is to dismiss it as a bluff and attack the messenger rather than address the substance, you have not answered the argument. You have confirmed that you have no answer to it. This goes far beyond a trade dispute. It's about whether the constitutional framework that governs international treaty obligations still functions as a meaningful constraint on executive action. If a president can unilaterally tear up a trade agreement he personally signed, bypassing Congress, bypassing the USTR, bypassing the legal framework the agreement itself specifies, then the question is no longer about Canada. The question becomes about what any American treaty commitment actually means going forward. If there are no consequences for this action, if the tariffs proceed, if the legal challenge is ignored, if Congress does not act, it signals to every nation with which the United States has a trade or security agreement that American commitments are conditional on the mood of whoever holds the presidency at a given moment. That is not a trade policy. That is the end of American credibility as a treaty partner. If this blows your mind as much as it should, hit that like button right now. Here's the situation as it stands today. Canada has invoked a formal legal challenge under the USMCA. Critical mineral export permits are under review. Retaliatory tariffs at 35% on American consumer goods are in effect. The USMCA dispute panel process has a mandatory 30-day consultation period before formal hearings begin, meaning a ruling is not expected before mid-spring at the earliest. Congressional Republicans in states with significant Canadian trade exposure are quietly negotiating with White House staff over whether the tariff level can be reduced before the damage becomes politically irreversible. Mark Carney has scheduled a speech before the Canadian Parliament for March 3rd, in which sources say he will announce additional measures. The European Union has expressed solidarity with Canada's legal position. Japan and South Korea, both of which have trade frameworks with the United States that contain provisions similar to those at issue in the USMCA, are watching this case with close attention. Keep a close eye on March 3rd. Keep a close eye on what happens in those Senate Commerce Committee corridors. And keep a close eye on the critical minerals export review. Because if Canada moves from a review to actual permit revocations, the defense industry's response will be swift and it will reach Capitol Hill with force. Here's where things stand right now. The President of the United States issued an ultimatum to Canada. Canada issued a counter-move that was faster, more legally sophisticated, and more economically precise than anyone in the Trump administration appears to have anticipated. The economic consequences are already registering in American markets. The legal consequences are unfolding in real time. And the institutional consequences for American treaty credibility, for the integrity of the USMCA framework, for the relationship between executive action and congressional oversight of trade may be the most enduring damage of all. This isn't just another news cycle. This is a constitutional and economic reckoning unfolding in real time. What happens in the next 30 to 60 days could determine whether the United States-Canada relationship can be repaired before it fundamentally reshapes North American trade and security architecture. And the precedent being set right now about whether a president can tear up his own treaty with impunity will outlast this administration, regardless of what happens next. The evidence is out there. The legal challenge has been filed. The retaliatory measures are in place. Now we wait to see whether accountability still holds any weight in Washington. The stakes have never been higher. The legal exposure has never been more clear, and the consequences of getting this wrong have never been more immediate.